Welcome, everybody, to the last final panel of the day. We're going to get started. Thanks, everyone. So this is the last panel of the day. It's on pathways towards multilateral diplomacy. I'm Shadon Liang, Senior Policy Analyst at the Arms Control Association for Nuclear Weapons Policy and Disarmament. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Three folks I'm always happy to hear from and to learn from. Before I turn it over to them, though, I'm going to lay the groundwork a little bit to bring everybody back up to speed with why we're talking about multilateral diplomacy and what's happened since New START expired on February 5th, 2026, earlier this year. Last year, the Trump administration was a bit quiet about its arms control policy and its priorities. We had the occasional comment from the president about denuclearization that he was interested in when Russia proposed on September 22nd to respect the New START limits after the treaty's expiry. He said casually it was a good idea, but nothing came of that. On the expiration of New START, the US made several key announcements about what its policy would be and what it would seek to do. Quote from Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, Thomas DiNanno, speaking at the Conference on Disarmament, he said, taking into account all Russian nuclear weapons, both novel and existing strategic systems, addressing the breakout growth of Chinese nuclear weapon stockpiles. These were the goals of the administration's policies, nothing particularly surprising there. So Christopher Yao, the Assistant Secretary for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, on February 17th said, following the expiration of New START, the United States proposed multilateral strategic stability talks as a means to achieving future nuclear arms control. And then he followed up April 29th at the RevCon, saying that the United States had provided detailed proposals to Russia and China, and among the P5 on possible initial steps, including on transparency, risk reduction, and nuclear testing. So this is why we are here to talk about the multilateral formats and the options, the potential and the pitfalls. A few other notes about what has transpired since New START expired. One is, of course, that Trump visited Beijing a couple weeks ago and said he discussed nuclear denuclearization with his counterpart Xi Jinping. But there's no confirmation from the Chinese side, and even Trump's account, which he gave to the press, doesn't suggest a substantial conversation. Trump's team has also accused China of conducting a nuclear test on June 22nd, 2020. So the president announced last year, of course, the intention to resume testing on an equal basis. And that's not going to be the focus of today's conversation, but it's important context for where we are. So to examine the set of where the administration has brought us, where we go from here, I'm happy to introduce Amy Nelson, Director of the Future Security Scenarios Lab and Senior Fellow with the Future Security Program at the New America Foundation, author of the forthcoming Arms Control Paradox from Stanford University Press. To my left, in the middle, Matthew Sharp, Senior Nuclear Fellow at the Center for Nuclear Security Policy with MIT's Security Studies Program, previously at the State Department for 17 years, and last, the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Affairs at the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability. And Tong Zhao, leading scholar of China's nuclear program and a senior fellow with the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a non-resident researcher with Princeton's Science and Global Security Program. Just to start off, Amy, can I ask you, what makes the post-New START era of arms control different? Right? What are some of the risks of continued failure to engage among the nuclear five? Aside from what the administration wants to do multilaterally, what should the US and Russia also be looking at in the near term? How should the US be thinking about the Russian offer to stay within New START limits? And potentially, is there, beyond quantitative arms control, is there some space for the P5 process to look at other issues like, for example, artificial intelligence, nuclear weapons, or the militarization of space, for example? Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I just so happen to have a few thoughts on those questions. Works out rather well. So there is a paradox at the heart of arms control that I've spent the last several years trying to deeply understand, which is that the conditions that make arms control most urgent are precisely the conditions that make it hardest to achieve. Today, we see it in deepening mistrust, collapsing communication channels, accelerating technology, and fracturing multilateral institutions. They don't just raise the stakes for diplomacy, but they actively undermine the tools diplomacy depends on. The paradox isn't new, but this post-New START moment, of course, is. Previous eras of arms control failure still had a load-bearing structure. During the tensest years of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union maintained functioning diplomatic channels, even when treaties weren't being signed. They established an interpretive infrastructure, shared definitions, verification mechanisms, and agreed frameworks for reading each other's signals. These were all largely intact, even when the political relationship wasn't. And so what we've lost, to answer your question, in the New START era isn't just the treaty, it's the architecture that makes the treaty possible. So what is different now? Well, we've lost that architecture now across three major dyads simultaneously. Russia's war in Ukraine and its nuclear signaling have corroded the normative foundations of arms control as a shared enterprise. And China's buildup has introduced genuine tripolarity into what was functionally a bipolar order. And the technology environment is different. We have AI integration into NC3, contending with hypersonics, militarization of space. All these things risk compressing decision timelines and complicating the attribution logic that we need for deterrence. So the result is a security landscape in which almost everything right now is nuclear and almost nothing nuclear is negotiable. I know you spoke this morning about what happened at the RevCon, and let me say, it failed not because states disagreed about what to do per se, but because they couldn't agree on what the facts were. Country-specific language about Iran became the proximate breaking point, but the deeper problem was that the shared vocabulary for assessing compliance, intent, and risk had already degraded. So much so past the point where a common document was possible. 3 consecutive RevCon failures aren't a streak of bad luck. They're a structural signal about the condition of the regime itself. And this matters for what our panel is here to address. The path back to arms control runs through interpretive infrastructure before it runs through treaties. So the near-term US-Russia question, and to your question about Russia, and the N5 discussions on AI and NC3 and space, these aren't separate problems at different scales. They actually both require a shared understanding of what the other side is doing to make communication credible. And that's actually a lower threshold than arms control, if there's good news here. It doesn't require trust, and it just requires a common vocabulary, functioning channels, and the political will to use them. On US-Russia, Russia's conditional and unverifiable offer to stay informally within New START limits is a starting point, obviously, but not a solution. The near-term agenda worth pursuing isn't a treaty. It's rebuilding the consultative infrastructure, the data exchanges, the transparency on force posture, and the functioning channels for clarifying ambiguous signals that make a future treaty even conceivable. On AI and space, these aren't disarmament problems. These are risk reduction problems. That distinction matters because risk reduction is achievable even when disarmament isn't. The official P5 process has actually never formally taken up AI and NC3 as an agenda item, despite, and I'll say multiple track 1.5 processes doing this conceptual groundwork for years. So the gap between what's been recommended and what's been adopted, it's not an oversight, it's a choice, and it's a costly one. Agenda items could include common definitions of AI-assisted versus AI-directed decision-making in nuclear command systems, incident reporting for NC3 anomalies, basic commitments not to target nuclear mission-critical space assets. None of this is transformative. All of it's relatively achievable, and in this environment, achievable matters. These measures are tractable. The obstacles aren't technical, But the way uncertainty that characterizes our security environment right now drives negotiators away from exactly this kind of engagement, the kind of engagement these measures require is what is impeding. So the book I recently finished, out this September, argues that the arms control paradox isn't actually a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be managed. Arms control is often approached as a calculation problem or a calcula problem. Identify the threat, estimate the probability, limit the exposure. But the historical record actually shows that negotiations unfold under genuine uncertainty where the probabilities are unknown. And when negotiators face that kind of uncertainty, the pull towards heuristics is powerful and understandable. These include in the arms control space, narrow quantitative limits, worst case scenario planning, agreements scoped to what can be counted rather than what needs to be managed. And actually the eras when we best managed the arms control paradox weren't the eras of the most ambitious treaties. They were the eras when negotiators actively sought to reduce uncertainty about capabilities, intentions, and the negotiation process itself, rather than defaulting to numbers they could count. So that's what the historical record teaches, and it's the standard I'd apply to what comes next. Not did we get a treaty, can we get a treaty, but are we rebuilding the specific conditions that make negotiation possible? The shared vocabulary, the functioning channels, the interpretive capacity to read one another's signals without defaulting to worst case assumptions. These are not utopian prerequisites. I think they're pretty operational ones. History suggests it may take a crisis to create the political will to pursue them, but the measures themselves, I think, are within reach now. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Amy. So Matthew, I was going to start by asking you, the U.S. proposals on nuclear risk reduction, transparency, nuclear testing, what should these be? Now that we're approaching from this perspective, why hasn't the U.S. pursued something multilateral before? Why hasn't that been the default approach to these problems? Is it realistic to think that all the five can make progress along these lines?
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks also to ACA for the invitation and for this great conversation today. I'm really happy to be here. Maybe I'll start towards those questions with an assertion that I think is out there. There's a narrative that the world has somehow changed in new, novel ways, and that the tools of arms control just don't exist, or at best make it very, very difficult to grapple with a new two-peer trilateral nuclear environment. I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong for two reasons. The first one is that I think it often misdiagnoses as weaknesses in the arms control tool set what are actually shortcomings in the stability of our deterrence models. And so those are two different problems, and I think a lot of people get that wrong. But the second reason I think it's incorrect is because I think we've done this before. I think there's a long history of multilateral arms control, and I think those fall in my mind into roughly five categories that I'd like to just walk through real quickly. The first is one that is based on what I would call uneven limits. Here, I think the Washington Naval Treaty is a great example where you can have not three, but five major powers placing limits on their capabilities, and those limits are not the same. And I think there's a lot of nuance and history that goes into explaining why that was possible in that instance. But it's an example that it can happen when you want to. A second category I would submit are limits that I would characterize as being collective limits. And here I'm thinking of something like the CFE, where you can have not three in this case, but 22 parties negotiating, and then 30 by the time the thing actually comes into force, with limits that are placed not on the individual members, but in some collective groups with some flexibility to redistribute among them. I think that's also relevant to the current situation and a little bit of a different model. The third is what I think of as requirements that are unlike among the participants. And my example here is START 1. So START 1, obviously, we primarily think of it as a treaty that limits the US and Russia, but when it enters into force, there are five participants, and each of them has nuclear weapons. And so I think the requirements there on those five participants look very different. The ones on Russia and the United States are what we all know. But for those other three, for Belarus and Kazakhstan and Ukraine, the requirements are engineered to move them from the status of a state with nuclear weapons on their territories to the status of a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT. And so I think those unlike requirements are another way that we've grappled with multilateral arms control in the past. INF, I think, actually is also an interesting example of that category that we can talk about more. A fourth category are requirements that are normative. Here, I think the NPT's Article 6 is a great example, and I think when you look back at the NPT at the very beginning, there aren't just two states with nuclear weapons that have special responsibilities. There's a third one there, and I think it's clear at the time that the UK understood that it had obligations under Article 6. It did not understand that obligation was to join some sort of trilateral arms control negotiation for arms limitations, but more in the direction of things like addressing nuclear tests and other things that I would characterize as normative limits. And then the fifth category, I think, is things that involve exchanges of information, transparency measures, things that sit in those two elements obviously fit into all of these other agreements as well, but they can exist by themselves as well. And I think that examples there are things like the HCOC, for instance, or the Vienna document. And so I'm very conscious that there are people in this room that know more about the history and the specifics of all of those agreements than I do, but I named them not to pretend otherwise, but to suggest that we've done this a number of times before. There are a lot of different ways that we can do it, and I would submit that our current situation with a sort of two-peer nuclear competition involving China, Russia, and the United States could draw on any one of those baskets and find solutions that are relevant, and Amy just named some examples of that. So we can come back to that, and I hope we will during the discussion about how it applies in the future. But to make sure to touch on your question, which is it that the Trump administration seeks? And here I think it's a little unclear, or rather, it's very clear, but it depends on who you're talking to. So President Trump, obviously a relevant stakeholder here, in the series of comments, Sharon, that you started with, there's one from last February that says, let's cut our military budget in half. There's no reason for us to be building brand new nuclear weapons. We already have so many. There are others in that list of statements that make me think he's clearly thinking of that first category. He's talking about limiting nuclear arsenals. He has in mind something that would actually be an arms limitation treaty that includes the three parties that he references. That seems pretty clear cut to me. But by the time we get to the statements this past February, which you also quoted from, Assistant Secretary Yaw's statement at the Hudson Institute included the line that you just read. President Trump's objective is to get to a better arms control agreement, and use multilateral strategic stability talks to get there. That's our marching orders, he said. Here, it seems like it's something very different. Like, yes, we will get to that Category 1 limits on nuclear arsenals, but there's something else that's going to happen first, and that looks a whole lot more like dialogue. That's what I think you saw come through the U.S. statements at the NPT. You read this quote as well. The United States, this is from the Main Committee 1 statement by Assistant Secretary Yaw. He said, quote, the United States is demonstrating leadership by proposing new multilateral strategic stability and arms control talks. This is a natural evolution of arms control to take account of the arsenals and threats we face today, end quote. And he ties that to the concrete proposals that sound like risk reduction measures that you mentioned just now. And so I think in these statements from February, we're looking at a very different scenario where we're looking maybe more in the fourth or fifth category that I named of things that we can do to try to pursue multilateral arms control. And so all those things are available to us. It seems like there's a little bit of an uncertainty on the US side about what exactly it is that we seek. But if you take the points I'm trying to lay out there, one is that this is possible. There are solutions for this. We know that because we've done it before, and those solutions come in a couple of different flavors. There's a little bit of uncertainty on the US side. Yes, we want to pursue multilateral nuclear arms control, but what that is left a little bit up in the air. I think there's an opportunity there, and it's an opportunity for the non-weapon states of the NPT to say, look, we heard you, we want to support you, we want to hear what you mean, we want to encourage China to take up the offer, as Assistant Secretary Yaw said in some of those statements. But we also want to know what it is that you're proposing. And if there aren't good answers to those questions, either from the Chinese side in terms of taking up the baton, or from the US side about what it is specifically that's going to be put forward, then there's an opportunity to fill that gap with some ideas. And so, again, we can talk about that more in discussion, but I think there are good answers in each of those categories that can be a whole lot of help.
All right, thanks, Matthew. So, Tong, the US is obviously primarily concerned almost nowadays about China's strategic nuclear buildup. Trump and Xi, they don't seem to have had a very serious or lengthy discussion about this in Beijing based on what we know about it. But what is it, the form or is it the type of proposal that the U.S. is bringing to China that is not working? So what do you make of this approach that the administration has made? And what arms control or limitation concepts should the U.S. even be considering or pitching to China at this point?
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's the right approach for the U.S. to propose this multilateral strategic stability dialogue, because China traditionally supports the term multilateral as well as the term strategic stability. So it increases the cost for China to reject the American initiative. Even though I heard from Beijing that people are still waiting to see concrete American proposals, and they are not in the mood to act proactively to suggest Chinese proposals. I think given China's emphasis on talking about capabilities and arms control on the basis of equal military capabilities, we have to perhaps use Matthew's framework of creating some collective limits if we are looking at P5 as a platform for multilateral strategic stability dialogue. And naturally, we could group the US, UK, and France together, and then Russia and China together, since that would make them on a relatively equal footing in terms of capabilities. But I worry that wouldn't work for Beijing, because Beijing worries that this type of grouping could formalize the new Cold War of bloc confrontation. So I think there is room, certainly, to upgrade the level of official participation at current P5 process. There is room to further encourage the participation of military representatives from the 5 countries to ensure substantive discussion. There is room for greater transparency to allow for better to allow for feedback from the international community and for international input into the process. But the topics at the P5 are hard to go beyond issues like doctrinal discussions or risk reductions, or the impact of emerging military technologies. There has been some really important development in US-China bilateral relations in recent months. Particularly at the Beijing summit, the 2 leaders agreed to this new concept of constructive strategic stability relationship, and that is viewed as a major achievement by Beijing. And we have seen China, really promoting this new concept at various international fora. So for Beijing, part of its nuclear buildup has been to compel the United States to accept a mutual vulnerability relationship. And this new concept of constructive strategic stability relationship, I think, helped achieve the same goal. It basically indicates American acceptance of peaceful coexistence with China and a commitment to not challenging China's core national interests. And even though for China this concept of constructive strategic stability applies more broadly to the overall relationship, but given its historical origin in the nuclear deterrence relationship literature, I think it helped promote some shared principles between the two sides on managing their nuclear and strategic security relations. And now I think the next task for us is to operationalize such very high level, very abstract principle. One example is, China has been criticizing that the U.S. development of global missile defense system is undermining global strategic stability. So a good starting point is to invite China to clarify what's its thinking, what's its definition of systems such as missile defense that would undermine global strategic stability. China itself has been developing all types of missile defense technologies, including interceptors that could shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles. So I think the U.S. can show a willingness to talk about missile defense issues by inviting China to explain its standards for, what type of missile defense it thinks undermines global strategic stability. Another bilateral cooperation that may be possible is to jointly address the rising risk of nuclear weapons in outer space. I think China is somewhat alarmed by reported Russia interest in this capability, and similarly by North Korea's implied interest in developing nuclear anti-satellite weapons. I think, given China's interest in maintaining access to outer space for both civilian and military purposes, this is in China's interest to keep outer space nuclear weapons free. Of course, China is reportedly developing its own fractional orbital bombardment system, but it looks like those are basically, special reentry vehicles potentially deployed on the DF-5C missiles in central China, so that China could strike U.S. homeland by flying over the South Pole rather than from the north. So it's still qualitatively different from wanting to place a nuclear weapon in outer space. So maybe I think there is space for U.S. and China to jointly strengthen outer space treaty and strengthen the norm against deployment of nuclear weapons in space. Let me end with a final point, which I think one really hopeful area of potential mutual restraint is about theater nuclear systems. And this is because there is increasing mutual concern about each other's capabilities and deployment regarding theater nuclear capabilities. For example, China is worried about American forward deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons to places near China. China worries that would indicate a greater American interest in nuclear first use in a conventional war with China, including in a Taiwan contingency. And the U.S. worries that China's expanding theater range nuclear systems indicates a potential Chinese shift toward nuclear first use doctrine. So I think there is space for mutual transparency on air-based and land-based theater range nuclear systems deployed within strike range of each other. That would cover American forward deployed systems and similar Chinese systems deployed near the Chinese east coast. Or even better, I think maybe they could, or the US could link its future decision to deploy American air-launched or land-based tactical nuclear weapons to East Asia to a Chinese willingness to limit Chinese similar systems within certain distance from China's east coast. That might be a useful confidence building measure or even arms control measure that would address a concern that both countries share. Thank you.
Thanks, Tong. So I'd prepared some questions for you myself, but the room was pretty unanimous in our first set of questions from the room about what they wanted to address, which was, I'm going to lay out to you. What are your thoughts about proposals for some type of nuclear freeze? Whether it's a overall freeze across the N5, right? Or perhaps certain systems on certain sides, or perhaps launcher freeze. Right? So this is an idea that has been supported for its simplicity, right? But also comes up to certain, I think, some pitfalls as well. So, Amy, would you have thoughts on that to start with?
Sure. Yeah, it's a lovely idea. I don't think numbers matter that much right now. And so great if you can get it as a signal of goodwill, a signal of collaboration, maybe even transparency if it's a verifiable freeze, but it doesn't solve the problem we're worried about, which is the world feels unstable right now, and it's difficult to calculate strategic stability. So that thing that would make it destabilize completely, or what would be required to restore it. And then, so the question becomes like, is this a beginning to something that would be more helpful later? Sure. I think that nuclear weapons eventually are self-limiting because they're so costly, and it's not the number of weapons that destabilizes. So, yeah. Sorry.
Sure, Matthew?
I guess I share the skepticism that a freeze on numbers is feasible, but I think it's worth being a little bit flexible in how we conceptualize the scope of any kind of arms control measure. And so when you say freeze, maybe that's a freeze in some broader sense. I think that right now we have at least two, and now I think with some of the announcements this spring from France, at least 3 and maybe 4 nuclear weapon states that are reacting to changes that they see in the strategic environment in the way that Amy said. Something is different from each of their perspectives, and they're responding to that by changing their capabilities. And I think that's driving some of the things that are going to lead us into potential real trouble. I think it'd be difficult to conceptualize what the scope of a freeze would be on the activities that are driving those new instabilities, but it's not outside of the universe of the possible. And so I think it does start with, you're gonna have to sit down and explain to each other what it is that you're seeing, what it is you're doing to respond, and then what the reactions to those steps might be. And without that information, then I think there's not a whole lot of reason for hope or optimism. And so I think one thing when it comes to this format question, looking at the U.S.-China dyad, we struggled mightily and ultimately unsuccessfully to have that kind of conversation bilaterally with China. But I think what the review conference just showed is that China feels a pressure in that multilateral venue that they don't feel when it comes to a bilateral conversation with us, that they're more forthcoming in that more public environment. They're more willing to put information into their national reports or their statements. And ultimately, there was language that was floated and allegedly acceptable to all that would have facilitated the kind of conversation that we've been asking for and haven't been able to achieve. And so I think, Tong may have explained it from the Chinese perspective. That suggests to me that there's an avenue there, and that to define what is a freeze, what freeze would actually help the problem, start with that conversation and by understanding what are those strategic drivers that are moving everybody to action.
Yeah.
I don't think China has seriously considered a freeze type of agreement, but maybe that's precisely why it is useful for us to, lay out some practical proposals and encourage national governments to seriously examine them and give feedback and express their concerns, so we can improve and refine those proposals. I think if we want to freeze all nuclear warheads, then it's hard to do it within a trilateral a system of US, Russia, and China, if we want to consider Chinese interest in some in the principle of equality in arms control talks, it will have to be between two groups within P5, with US, Russia, US, UK, France on one side, and Russia, China on the other. That's politically challenging for Beijing. But another potential phrase is what at least to have a joint discussion about a joint restraint measures can take place among China, the UK, and France, right? At the RevCon, I think Chinese ambassador Shen Jian suggested China belongs to the second tier nuclear weapon states. And that means there is some equality among China, the UK, and France, and that may provide appropriate format for those three countries to discuss a joint restraint in order to facilitate the two major superpowers' bilateral arms control process. We can also certainly consider all delivery systems, regardless of the nature of the warhead, nuclear or conventional, and we can count all delivery systems that have range at and beyond 500 kilometers. That might create some equality among US, Russia, and China, given China's huge arsenal of theater range conventional missile systems. Or we can broaden this all delivery upper limit type of arrangement within P5. So I think in theory, there are always ways that we can innovatively create equality and make it harder for national countries to say no.
All right, so Amy, this question I'm going to put it to you is, while the US pursues this multilateral format, are there things that the US and Russia could be talking about on the side? Setting aside for now, the Russian seems to be a resumption of the position that they don't want to talk about any arms control while the war continues. But if the US were to pursue bilaterally with Russia some topics that have been kind of on the board for the last 15 years since New START, what would be kind of the priorities there?
That's a good question. So what worries me most is the lack of understanding of policy and doctrine and the kind of garbled nature of interpretations when they eventually get applied. And so, sure, a return to strategic stability dialogues would be effective, discussions of missile defenses, SLICAMEN deployment is coming up over the horizon. These would all be fruitful paths forward, I think.
Okay, all right. Matthew, thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I guess I think Amy made a really strong case before that the numbers in New START are maybe not the most important thing. And I think a lot of focus in the run-up to February was on whether or not the numbers could be maintained as limits going forward. And I guess that's what President Putin was suggesting in his famous offer, although I'm not sure that was ever totally clear. What I'd like to see with Russia would be, let's talk about everything else in New START. The numbers are the part that's kind of hard for us while China is doing whatever it's doing. Let's talk about, yes, the dialogues, but let's talk about, visits, transparency visits. Can we keep up the kind of infrastructure that you need to communicate and to be providing the advanced notices of things like missile launches? And I think those pieces are important not only in the way that Amy described for the US-Russia dynamic, but they'd be a great place to start bringing China or the rest of the P5 in as well.
Yeah, Tong, I have a slightly different question for you. So in this month's Arms Control Today, we have an article from Alexei Arbatov who suggests, the US should make suggestions to Beijing that would not legalize Chinese inferiority in the types of weapons to be subject to, right? So going back to the idea of partial limits or like that. I read this and I think he's probably talking about ICBMs. We're not so far off the number of silos and so on. But perhaps you have other ideas about, the partial ideas or partial limits that the U.S. and China could be looking at, and the difficulty of the idea of inferiority, because it's hard to hide the ball on this, right? It's hard to hide what the U.S. intention is. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how the U.S. could approach this.
Yeah, I think at the risk of repeating myself, there is space for serious discussion about tactical nuclear systems, and that's also where the risk of a conventional war escalating to the nuclear level is most serious. And that's where China's nuclear system is significantly entangled with conventional military systems. So I would suggest a partial limit focusing on those types of theater range nuclear systems. Again, that's where China is really worried about future American capability development and deployment in places near China. And you don't see such Chinese concern regarding other types of US nuclear systems, especially strategic systems. And I would also, this relates to the previous question between US and Russia. I think, I have heard some Chinese scholars, it's hard to tell how much this reflects Chinese government interest, but at least serious Chinese scholars have expressed interest in learning about US-Russian arms control mechanisms, the procedures, the technologies, the inspection system. So one way to maintain US-Russian bilateral process is to, again, offer the opportunity for Chinese observers to observe US-Russian, how they conduct data sharing and even on-site inspections. We need this process of socialization to familiarize Chinese experts and officials with such process and procedures and technologies to create the condition for Chinese political level interest down the road. And U.S. Russia has used the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Centers to partly support data sharing, and that's another mechanism I think is lacking in the sense that there are hotlines between U.S. and China, but there is no communication system that allows immediate communication that allows immediate one-way communication without the requirement for the other side to pick up the phone and offer immediate response. I think that's a major constraint on the Chinese part. But the need for a timely communication system to allow immediate transfer of information is certainly there. So I think that's some opportunity for strengthening the current U.S.-China bilateral crisis management system.
All right, thank you, Tom. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for this panel today, but this is a conversation I think will be ongoing in many spaces. And first of all, I'd like to invite all of you to thank the panel for a wrap-up. And hand it back to Daryl.